quiet of a brisk October morning in 1960. Liquid oxygen bathes a launch pad in an ominous fog. The Soviet Union is poised to take a giant leap ahead in the burgeoning space race. Deep in the steppes of Kazakhstan, hundreds of miles from civilization, and a world away from Western eyes, a powerful new rocket points skyward. Two previous endeavors have failed. They are determined to make it work now, at any expense. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 had kicked off a feverish era of space exploration. While the Americans struggled with their Vanguard rockets, the Soviets sent a dog named Laika into orbit. Their Luna probes dazzled the world, hitting the moon in September of 1959, then taking photographs of the dark side a month later. The U.S. had successes with Explorer and Ranger, but the Soviets were clearly leading the pack, and by long strides. Even as the rocket readied for takeoff, Premier Nikita Khrushchev was in New York for a United Nations meeting, anxious to gloat about another Soviet success while on American soil. Back in Kazakhstan, the pressure was on to launch now, no matter what. During the countdown, a malfunction was discovered. Normally, this would result in a postponement, but not on this day. Fuel surged through the rocket boosters. Minutes later, the compound exploded into an inferno that would claim nearly 200 lives. The world was left with hearsay, rumor, and speculation. Until now. Unexplained deaths, harrowing encounters in space, phenomena that puzzled the world for decades. These are the files long hidden behind the impenetrable seal of the Iron Curtain. Today, we can finally explore those hidden vaults, bringing to light the darkest mysteries of the secret Russian space program. From the beginning, the Soviets and Americans amazed the world with their stellar achievements. But that glory has been marred by disaster. Time and time again, the deadly matrix of politics, human nature, and destiny has shattered the myth of technological perfection. While rocket power has boosted humanity to new heights, its searing flames remind us that in the perilous pursuit of outer space, false starts are often fatal. The environment of space is even less forgiving. The smallest miscalculation can boil blood in minutes, or leave a spacecraft and its passengers marooned in orbit as life slowly trickles away. 1967. In the hasty race to beat each other to the moon, someone was bound to make a mistake, a deadly one. The Americans would misstep with the fiery deaths of the Apollo 1 astronauts. Then the Soviets, in their rush to the moon, would follow with the first in-flight death of a cosmonaut. It wouldn't be their only taste of tragedy and regret. Violent explosions on the launch pad, fatal miscalculations, and crucial equipment failures. The margin between life and death can be harrowingly thin. Sometimes fate smiles. Other times, it turns a blind eye. True stories, like that of the Soviets' deadliest disaster, are finally being pieced together. The missile poised in the launch pad that pivotal day in October 1960 was the R-16 ICBM, the pet project of Mikhail Kuzmich Yangel. It was a rocket designed to deliver deadly nuclear warheads to the U.S. This would be Yangel's first test at a newly constructed launch pad at Baikonur, and it was scheduled for the anniversary of the Great October Revolution. Marshal Nedelin was the commander-in-chief of the Strategic Missile Forces. He would conduct the test himself. Many of the top military officers and rocket designers were there to watch the historic launch. But the launch was off to a disappointing start. An electrical problem threatened to abort the entire mission. Protocol demanded that technicians deactivate the boosters and drain the fuel. But that would mean weeks of delay. For Nedelin and the prestige this launch represented, failure was not an option. Sergei Khrushchev learned of the classified disaster from his father, former Premier Nikita Khrushchev.
But because they thought that they saved the marshal, who was the head of the commission, he took his chair and sit under the missile. And all other people gathered around the missile, which was full, which is crazy.
Indeed, Marshal Nedelin's confidence was in vain. As engineers tried to fix the problem, they accidentally triggered the ignition sequence.
The engine began to work. Of course, it was just burned the first stage, and 150 or 160 tons of all this stuff just dropped down, and it began the fire, and they burned everything there.
Within seconds, the pad was a towering inferno. What you are seeing is that actual disaster. 126 people died instantly, including Nedelin, charred beyond recognition. 50 more would die later from their injuries. The world's greatest single missile catastrophe. While burning victims tried and failed to make their way out of the raging inferno, others walked directly into its burning center. They weren't going in to save their comrades. What they were after was of much higher priority. They risked their lives to preserve this flaming box. What secrets that box contained may someday also come to light. Until that day, it remains yet another of the unexplained mysteries that comprise the Soviet space archives. Nothing in the known annals of space history matches the Nedelin catastrophe in terms of life lost. But it was hardly their only disaster. In 1969, the Soviets prepared to launch their second generation of Mars probes. The United States had edged ahead in the race to the moon, so a successful Mars launch would be an appropriate reply. These probes were to be carried by the powerful new Proton booster, which had 3 times the thrust of the earlier booster and 3 times the troubles. Though its designers gave it only a 50-50 chance of success, political forces deemed it worth the risk. None of the 3 launches were successful, but the attempt you are witnessing nearly turned fatal. Luckily, the rocket crashed on an uninhabited area of the base. This disaster was preserved on film. The legacies of countless others have evaporated as quickly as the smoke that swirled around their burning wreckage. Like the launch fire at Plesetsk in March 1980, which to this day remains shrouded in mystery. Film of the blast and fire were destroyed, and no photography was permitted at the funerals of those who died. For Alexander Kosuk, the experience is permanently seared into his memory. Half an hour before the launch, he descended these stairs to an underground bunker. The Soviets had been attempting to launch a spy satellite when an oxygen leak was discovered. Rather than follow safety procedure, an oily rag was used to temporarily stop the leak. It ignited almost immediately.
And at that time, there was a big blast. The bunker was full of flame and hot gas. Then another blast, a third one. So nearly all the people near the booster, the combat team, perished. 49 people altogether.
Whatever the flames didn't consume, the Soviets made sure to get rid of. They succeeded in destroying all evidence, but they could never erase the painful remembrance.
This can never be forgotten.
But how can these victims be remembered when they are not officially even a part of sanctioned history? This hushed policy of secrets and lies has its roots decades in the past. In the early 1960s, while the Americans were developing the Gemini two-man spacecraft, the Soviets were also developing their larger Soyuz spacecraft. But Khrushchev was anxious for more space firsts. Engineers quickly came up with the Voskhod spacecraft, and the Soviet need to top its rivals with space triumphs continued. Voskhod 1 would carry a crew of 3 into orbit. As Voskhod 1 landed, Leonid Brezhnev was hustling Khrushchev off the Soviet stage. But the space race continued. Soviet spacecraft Voskhod 2 was launched March 18, 1965. In the first spacewalk, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov took a step into the abyss while the world watched. What few people realized was that the first man to walk in space was almost the first one to die there. Yet another of the many shocking secrets newly liberated from the vaults of Soviet history. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, much of the previous deception of the Cold War era has vanished. Now, in order to sell their launch services on the open market, the former Soviet states are required to divulge their secrets, providing the world with detailed analysis of its failures as well as its successes. Some of the uncovered secrets date to the origins of the space race. Others, much to the world's surprise, happened after the Cold War. In a blow to Russian claims of reliability, 1996 resulted in 2 explosions of their most successful booster. Considered the workhorse of their program, the Soyuz U rocket had launched over 1,100 spacecraft. An investigation determined that both disasters were caused by defective parts. With sloppy mistakes such as these, it is easy to see why the newly independent Soviet nations, struggling to survive economically, would want to hide their failures. In the past, it was political motivation that turned truth into obscurity. With the opening of Soviet society, the world is learning about this hidden past. It is a history filled with failures and near misses, forgotten heroes and unknown cover-ups. Information that may have saved lives had it been revealed. In March of 1965, Alexei Leonov became the first man to walk in space. The world would revel in his success, but little would they know how close he came to ultimate failure. When Leonov returned to the spacecraft, he discovered an unforeseen problem. His spacesuit had ballooned more than expected. He couldn't bend his arms or legs. He floated helplessly, unable to maneuver his body back into the hatch. Dangling in the abyss, he began to panic. As his pulse and respiration soared, his body began to depressurize. He was soaked in sweat, his visor becoming foggy. He took a risk and lowered the pressure in the suit. This enabled him to squeeze through the airlock head first, he had barely survived with his life. And Leonov's terrifying odyssey wasn't over yet. On re-entry, the Prime retro rocket system failed. Then, the navigation system malfunctioned, and the cosmonauts had to land manually. They landed 2,000 miles off course in the taiga forest of the Ural region. As day turned to night, the temperature plunged below zero. Wolves circled the men. They slept cramped in the capsule, huddled against freezing temperatures and the snarling creatures outside. Finally, after hours of misery, a ski patrol rescued them. In publicly recounting his spacewalk, Leonov put on a good show for the Soviet space program. He failed to mention the dire sequence of events that nearly cost him his life. His non-disclosure would be costly for Americans. Ambitious to match the Soviet achievement, NASA hurried to get its own astronauts walking in space. One of the first, Eugene Cernan, repeated the same harrowing experience that Leonov had, fighting for his life in a spacesuit that didn't function properly in the vacuum of space. It wasn't the first time that a lack of openness between space agencies had dire and even deadly consequences. Valentin Bondarenka was the youngest member of the first cosmonaut team. In March of 1961, he went into an isolation tank. For 10 days, he ate, slept, and worked in an environment of pure oxygen. The test went perfectly until the final day, when the young cosmonaut was wrapping up the experiment. Using an alcohol-dipped swab, he removed some sensors from his body. He tossed the swab towards the trash, but missed. An innocent slip-up would prove fatal. The swab had landed on the hot plate he'd used to prepare his meals. Flames exploded, consuming the pure oxygen and raging into a deadly inferno. For nearly 30 minutes, the cosmonaut was burned alive while rescuers struggled to open the sealed door. The charred body they finally pulled out was still alive, but barely. Dr. Vladimir Gulyakovsky was the doctor on call when Bondarenka was brought to the hospital.
He didn't have skin in his extremities, in his body. He didn't have skin in his face. He didn't have hair. He didn't have eyes even, and lips also. So it was completely burned out person. Despite of this condition, he managed to talk, and I bent over to his face to be able to hear his voice. And was terrible smell, you know, it was difficult even to come closer to him. So I bent over his face and I heard that he said, "It's too much pain, do something, kill the pain."
The once vibrant cosmonaut was doomed, lingering for 16 hours in inconsolable pain and misery. The embarrassing incident was entombed along with its victim. Without the benefit of the Soviets' experience, the Americans would have to learn Bondarenka's tragic lesson firsthand. On January 27, 1967, the Apollo 1 crew, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, entered their spacecraft for a pre-flight test. As was the case with Bondarenka, the capsule was pressurized and enriched with pure oxygen. And as Bondarenka, these astronauts would perish when this oxygen atmosphere turned a small spark into an all-consuming inferno. The accident report blamed shoddy wiring for causing the spark that started the fire, the flammability of materials, the oxygen-rich atmosphere that allowed the spark to become a holocaust, as well as the lack of a quick-release escape hatch. But what seemed unavoidable could have been averted if only the Americans had known what happened to Bondarenka. Despite their best efforts, the engineers at the helm of both space programs were operating in untested realms of experience. Devising contingency plans was as much the stuff of imagination as hard science. In such uncharted territory, death was often cheated by the thinnest of margins. Such was the case with two cosmonauts who had experienced their own life and death drama. Gennady Strikalov and Vladimir Titov were ready for their mission. On September 26, 1983, about 90 seconds before Soyuz T-10A was to lift off, a malfunction resulted in a fuel spill which quickly ignited. An abort was commanded, but the communications lines had already been burnt through. As flames engulfed the booster, a backup radio command activated the abort sequence. The cosmonauts were a few seconds away from perishing in the conflagration. Here, as we see actual footage of this event, the escape system worked, and the capsule pulled away from the booster 6 seconds before it exploded in a ball of flaming death. In a perfect world, the tragedies of the past would provide us with lessons for the future. In a world where history is manipulated, there can be no such consolation. On January 28, 1986, the bleachers at Cape Canaveral were filled with excited onlookers, families, and friends. But their overflowing pride would do nothing to prevent the horror of what took place. A mid-air explosion that blasted the shuttle into pieces. Had the Americans been aware of the details of the near disaster aboard Soyuz T-10A just 2 years earlier, perhaps they wouldn't have been blinded by their self-confidence. Over 25 years after the Soviet Nedelin catastrophe, a space program was once again driven by political pressure, allowing the fatal consequences of haste to yet again martyr the exploration of space. Over the years, experience, safety precautions, and technology all combined to make spaceflight safer. But political pressure, human error, and cruel fate repeatedly made for a combustible and often tragic mixture. (1967) was a very anxious time for the Soviets. It had been 20 months since the last manned Voskhod flight, and the first manned launch of their new Soyuz program had still not yet occurred. During this period, the Americans flew 10 manned Gemini flights, successfully completing many maneuvers necessary for a lunar landing. But it was also the year that Apollo 1 burned on the launch pad, killing 3 astronauts and sending NASA back to the drawing boards. With a successful launch, the Soviet Union could boast the superiority of Soyuz over Apollo and regain the initiative in the race to the moon. The authorities wanted this new victory in time for the 50th anniversary of the Great October Revolution. There had been 4 unmanned test flights of the Soyuz re-entry vehicle, but none had been successful. In fact, each unmanned test had shown new problems. But as the gap between manned missions extended, political pressure for another Soviet space spectacular grew. And there was no one in the program with the authority to defy the Politburo. A spectacular space mission involving veteran cosmonauts was devised. 2 manned spacecraft, Soyuz 1 and 2, would be launched. They would perform an untried docking and crew transfer in space. Fanfare surrounded the pioneering project, but back at Mission Control, engineers were filled with dread. They simply weren't ready. Even the chief designer refused to certify the launch. Still, the Soyuz went to space. Piloting the ship was cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov. It wasn't long before the Soyuz 1 began to show the signs of malfunction that everyone on the ground dreaded. At the outset, one of the solar panels hadn't deployed. Then, the altitude control systems failed. Because of Soyuz 1's unreliable performance, Soyuz 2 was never launched. All efforts were put into the safe return of Soyuz 1. We know now that no matter how skillfully Komarov piloted the spacecraft, his fate had already been sealed. The Soyuz 1 was, the moment it rolled onto the launch pad, a death ship. Lurking silently within its belly was an untested parachute, a lifeline destined to fail. And aboard the Soyuz 1, a cosmonaut was fated to die. Nothing could save the doomed ship as it fell, end over end, towards Earth. From the top of the atmosphere, the capsule plummeted. Komarov impacted the ground at over 300 miles per hour. At the height of the moon race, news of such gross negligence could not get out, and so Komarov's story was buried along with his mangled corpse. And meanwhile, the world, blind to the death and disaster that had come before, celebrated the successes with enthusiasm. On July 23, 1969, when Neil Armstrong made that small step for man, the Americans made a giant leap in the seesaw race to the moon by crossing the finish line first. Ever the experts at propaganda, the Soviets feigned disinterest. They didn't televise the moon landing and barely covered it in print. They immediately denied that they ever intended to send a manned flight to the moon and proclaimed that they were turning their energies toward their space station program, Salyut, a program that would ensure a string of firsts, as the Americans had no such programs. Salyut was the first orbital laboratory in the world with the capability of long space flights. It was a plum assignment for a young cosmonaut named Pyotr Koloidin and his crewmates Alexei Leonov and Valery Kubasov. But fate had different plans. 2 days before the launch, the primary crew had their last medical test. A dark spot showed up on Kubasov's lung, and the flight commission replaced him with a backup. When Koloidin and Leonov were overheard lamenting the substitution of their comrade, they too were replaced, a seeming injustice, but one that would save their lives. And so in June 1971, Soyuz 11 took off without them. The craft completed the first successful docking with an orbital laboratory, and cosmonauts Viktor Patsayev, Georgy Dobrovolsky, and Vladislav Volkov spent nearly 3 weeks aboard the Salyut 1. But not all went smoothly. What you're about to hear is a real emergency in space, a chilling encounter with death too distressing to be revealed until now.
Почтение вам по программе на 3 витка последних, а потом поговорим, ладно?
Ох, елки зеленые, что-то у нас целый день сегодня одни уточнения напичкаешь.
Вильталь, примите форму 23.
Подожди, нам сейчас не до этого, у нас пахнет на борту горелым чем-то.
Понял вас? Сообщайте.
Что сообщать, пахнет? Янтарь 3 на связи.
Слушаю вас.
А что слушать, тут не поймем, откуда дым идет. Разбираемся.
Дым идет уже?
Да, идет. Но тут закрыто наглухо панели, не можем добраться быстро. Сейчас возьмем отвертки, будем вертеть. Тут сотни 2 винтов.
Понял. Янтарь 2, выключайте всю ненужную аппаратуру.
Так это понятно, ты понимаешь, мы не знаем, что горит. Может быть, кабель горит, но его в жгуте не можем проверить. Понимаешь, запах идет из-под приборной доски. Мы скрыли панель приборной доски под ней. Обгоревший кабель в жгуте, и запах продолжает идти.
Если вы будете переходить в СНКТ и делать расстыковку, то расстыковка штатная, завершающая операцию только по нашему указанию.
Леха, подожди. Нам некогда здесь будет соображать, если дело дойдет до серьезного. Я тебе задаю вопрос. Если здесь создастся ситуация, которая для нас опасна, мы заходим в ОСА, закрываем люк.
Закрываете перед собой люк.
Поняли, но мы так, эти сутки.
В общем, по нашим данным, у вас все...
It seemed the danger had passed. The world sighed in relief. During their 3 weeks in space, the Soviet Union had given the mission extensive media coverage. The Salyut program was painted as much more challenging than the Apollo moon landings. A triumphant return was planned. As they neared the Earth's atmosphere, the cosmonauts fired off a series of rockets that would separate their return capsule from the rest of the module. But there was a glitch in the procedure. The force of the explosive bolts caused a valve to jerk open, rapidly sucking the air out of their cabin and turning their haven into a deadly vacuum. The cosmonauts hadn't been issued pressurized spacesuits because the craft was too small. One can only imagine the terror inside the capsule as they realized they had only 20 seconds worth of life left. When they arrived at the spacecraft, the stunned recovery crew hoped that the cosmonauts were simply unconscious. This dramatic footage shows their futile attempts at resuscitating them. The violent re-entry had caused their blood to boil for over 10 minutes. While a nation honored its martyred heroes with a memorial on the Kremlin wall, cosmonaut Kaloydin was burdened with a deeper grief.
I thought that I was somewhat guilty for his death, but Volkov was doomed in any scenario. And now I don't worry anymore, because I understand then I could do nothing.
Death knows nothing of geography or politics. The annals of space history are filled with the names of those who gave their lives to push the envelope of man's domain. Fortunately, not all the stories end in tragedy. Fate still manages to smile upon those seeking out the mysteries of space, even when the odds seem stacked against them. Space is an unforgiving dominion. Hurling through the barren vacuum, there is no lifeline, no safety net, and little room for error. Perhaps the most dramatic example of a space rescue remains the U.S. Apollo 13 flight.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
Once in orbit, emergencies haunted the crew of this April 1970 flight from the moment an onboard liquid oxygen tank exploded. After a treacherous journey back toward Earth, Apollo 13 re-entered the atmosphere, not knowing if their protective heat shield would keep them from literally roasting to death in the 6,000-degree re-entry. And if they did make it that far, they couldn't know whether their parachutes would even deploy. Tense moments passed as they re-entered Earth's atmosphere and went out of communications range. On Earth, all ears strained to hear sounds of life as Apollo regained radio contact. This time, fate was gracious. The Soviet version of Apollo 13 launched on April 10, 1979. The Soyuz 33 mission was the fourth international flight, whose crew included a Bulgarian cosmonaut. All was going routinely as they were preparing to rendezvous with Salyut 6. Then, on the Soyuz, something went dreadfully wrong. The tension grew as Mission Control consulted with cosmonauts already on board the station, waiting to greet the Soyuz crew.
Протоны. Вы видите пламя из двигателей Сатурна. Вы видите пламя?
Это было не как всегда. Это двигалось в сторону.
Вы видите это отчетливо?
Да, я уверен.
The Salyut crew had confirmed the unthinkable. For the first time in roughly 2,000 firings, the Soyuz main rocket engine had failed. It was the third mission for cosmonaut Nikolai Rukavishnikov, and definitely the most perilous.
We had an explosion at the rear engine of our Soyuz 33 ship. We could not dock with the station. Furthermore, we could barely return from orbit. It was a critical situation, and we had a good chance of not returning to Earth.
While Mission Control struggled for some way of bringing the ship home, Rukavishnikov realized the nightmarish possibility of being marooned in space with only 5 days of supplies. The crew would have to use their reserve engine for an emergency landing, but there was no way of knowing if it still worked without trying it. Mission Control ordered Soyuz to fire their backup engine. No one had to tell the crew what would happen if it didn't work up to capacity. The cosmonauts were already picturing that dreadful scenario. If the engine worked less than 90 seconds, Soyuz 33 would remain a live satellite for 5 days, then become just a satellite containing corpses. The reserve engine worked. It would mean they'd have to return to Earth at a steep trajectory and withstand a painful 10 Gs. But they would return to Earth alive. It wasn't the first time a Soyuz spacecraft nearly became a ship of death. On April 5, 1975, Soyuz 18A was intended to dock with the Salyut 4 space station. The flight never made it into orbit. The A2 booster malfunctioned, and the rocket began to deviate from the planned altitude.
During the launch of the spacecraft, we got a message from the cosmonauts. Accident! Accident with the booster!
The Soyuz fired its engines in a retroburn. Like Soyuz 33, they would return to Earth in a ballistic trajectory. But this time, with double the agonizing pressure, a bone-crushing 20 Gs. Cosmonaut Vasily Lazarov lived through the agonizing ordeal.
We were getting 10 Gs during training on the centrifuge, but this was 20.6 Gs. So to stand it was hard. Everything was floating, cracking, bones and the craft.
The G-forces wouldn't be their only hurdle to survival. The Soyuz landed in darkness and deep snow in the Altai Mountains. The cosmonauts made a chance decision.
Before the landing, not knowing where we were landing, I made a decision to shoot off just one of the lines that held the parachute. And this saved us because we landed in a forest and were entangled by the trees. But we were on the brink of a cliff. If I had shot off both lines, we would have been carried over the cliff.
While officially landing in the Altai Mountains of the Soviet Union, the cosmonauts were in a rocky region of northwest China, less than a mile from the Mongolian border, and around 50 miles from the Soviet border. The Chinese were never notified of the intrusion. A safe landing was not fated for Soyuz 23 either. In October 1976, after a failed automatic docking with the Salyut 5 space station, Soyuz 23 was ordered back to Earth. The troubles for Soyuz 23 were just beginning. Entering their descent, Mission Control miscalculated the timing of the engine fire. This would result in a deviation in the landing area. They landed on frozen Lake Tengiz. All cosmonauts are trained for water landings, but this training hadn't taken into consideration the conditions that existed on this October evening in 1976. The craft splashed down in the lake. in squall-force winds and fog with temperatures hovering around 6 degrees Fahrenheit. The capsule was about 8 kilometers from the northern shore, where helicopters couldn't reach it due to the thick fog. The perilous rescue attempt was the responsibility of General Vladimir Shatalov.
We were in emergency situation all day because the helicopters could do nothing. In the mist that covered the lake, helicopters could not fly. The crew was held captive in their craft.
Inside the capsule, the cosmonauts followed standard procedure. But this was not a standard situation. It was the first and only mission for Vyacheslav Zudov.
The capsule was inclining approximately this way.
They were now stuck in a precarious position, head down in the water. The cosmonauts had no option but to wait.
We had no possibility to get out of the capsule as we were taught. If we opened the hatch, which was underwater, there would be no chance to get out. Besides, the temperature on Tengiz was minus 22 degrees centigrade.
Now the cosmonauts faced real danger. With the capsule upside down, the valve connecting to the outside atmosphere was submerged. They had no way to get fresh air. They had to use the regeneration system to supply oxygen, but they were running low on power.
To stay in such a situation in the spacesuits and do nothing, we would freeze to death. We started to save electric power. We switched off all sources inside the capsule. Left on only the beacon and radio that we would need to use. But they soon failed.
Valery Rozdesvinsky feared the worst as the cosmonauts slipped in and out of reality.
You could feel the CO2 without instrumentation. Just feel it. When I felt close to losing consciousness, then I would switch on the regeneration. Then, when my mind started to clear and the blue haze disappeared from my eyes, I'd switch it off, and so on, all through the night.
9 hours after the landing, helicopters were able to locate the craft. Frogmen attached flotation aids and a tow line to it. As we see in these rare photos of the actual rescue, the helicopter couldn't lift the capsule, but was able to drag it 8 kilometers to shore. This time, death was cheated by the slimmest of margins. Though countless advances have made Earth's orbit seem more accommodating now, near misses like the Mir collision and decompression on June 25, 1997, are reminders that space is still a dangerous place. When American astronaut C. Michael Foale replaced astronaut Jerry Linenger aboard the Mir, NASA hoped that the worst of the near disasters were over. Linenger had endured a near collision with a cargo ship, as well as an ongoing litany of mechanical and electrical breakdowns, including an intense fire.
The fire was basically in this region here, with the flame shooting across this way. And therefore, as you can see where the camera is basically where I was at, and we had one other body in front of me. I was passing the fire extinguisher. At that time, the other Soyuz was on the other side where Progress is now docked. So as you can see, it would have been very difficult to get through the flame itself to get to to one of the rescue vehicles.
Foale was to fare worse. Mission Control wanted to attempt a manual docking with a Progress cargo vehicle. Because of previous problems with the docking system, they decided to attempt the hookup with the radar system off. In Soviet tradition, human error was blamed for what would happen next. But as the facts have emerged, it's become apparent that the Mir was a victim of faulty planning. The crew nearly paid for these mistakes with their lives. The cosmonauts had practiced this manual docking maneuver before, but only with an empty cargo ship. This one was heavy and approaching fast. But without the main radar system, there was no way to know how fast or how far away it was at any given time. This lack of crucial information would nearly prove fatal. Cosmonaut Vasily Sopliev tried to slow the capsule with the braking lever, but the progress kept coming. From the porthole, cosmonaut Alexander Lasutkin watched the progress fly over the docking port.
I asked the technicians, how do you see the side of the station? By radar or on the screen? They replied, but nothing is on the screen. By radar, of course. So if we had radar, there would be nothing to talk about.
As Lasutkin ordered Foal to the Soyuz vehicle for evacuation, Progress crashed into Mir. The entire space station shook. The master alarm began to blare. The collision had caused an air leak. The life-sustaining atmosphere of the Mir was being sucked into the vacuum of space. The quick-thinking crew was able to save the station by severing a series of power cords so that they could seal off the damaged area. Mir survived the first decompression of an orbiting spacecraft. A split second later, a slightly larger impact, or a different course of action, and it all might have ended there for Mir and the men on board. The Mir collision has become legendary in space history. But had fate not smiled on them that day, their account might have been concealed, distorted, or forgotten like so many of the stories before them. Today, the murky depths of the Soviet space archive are just beginning to divulge their secrets. Some of them so bizarre, so irrational, they seem fated to remain forever a puzzle. But other newly liberated files are answering questions, explaining the great mysteries of space, and filling the void with a rich, colorful human history.